Alright, so I thought I'd do a slightly different tool review this time. This one I thought I'd get into about how to get your kids having a go with tools in as safe as possible way. Now, I stress safe as possible. I'm going to say the disclaimer because obviously you are the best guardian of your child or children. So, this is with, good advice, but ultimately use your own judgment at the end. So what I found is I've got a toddler, and to be honest, this whole thing started with these little scissors. So as you can see, these are by Helix. They're called Oxford, and they started out because obviously as a parent, you're supposed to have something when they run with scissors or whatever. You've got something which is relatively safe. So it's the sort of training wheels of scissors before you get onto any beasts like this, which I have lying around. So from there, what was interesting is I sort of started to watch my son and realized a lot of it is really about their grip needing to have a lot more chunkiness to it. So I remember when I was about his age, my gran would have me chopping vegetables with this, which is a butter knife. If anyone's not familiar with UK Sheffield steel, this is how these things turn up in charity shops. And essentially what I did was realize that this handle was way too slim and his hand would just slip in it, and it really wouldn't have the grip that he needed to chop vegetables. And this was actually at about the age of 2 years old. And so I realized that not only did I need a chunkier handle, and I think a really great example of this is if you see the contrast on these toothbrushes. I mean, this really illustrates the point, the sort of the thickness that kids need to get a good grip to do something which is even not high force of brushing their teeth. This is quite high force of chopping. So I thought this was sort of really an interesting thing, and obviously my background in product design and ergonomics and all these sorts of things, this stuff is obvious in hindsight, but sometimes you need just a bit of a trigger, so don't beat yourself up if it wasn't blindingly obvious. But so I've got a link and I'll put it in the bottom of how I essentially went from here to this, which is a little knife that I made, and I ended up basically putting this little bit of just tree branch that I found and sanding it down ultimately so it's into shape. And there's a bit of a knack to this, but obviously you get the idea. It's about making things more chunky. So with that in mind, a nice easy one is basically these Stubby Hammers. So at the weekend I was basically smashing apart pallets to make a little garden patch borders, and obviously my son wanted to help out, so I felt this was sort of like a good way to let him have a go. But again, this is why you're grateful of things like this, because he still got pretty close to his eyes on the backswing, even when I was sort of watching him very carefully. And again, sometimes you're really beating the heck out of stuff with a crowbar, or sometimes you use the bandsaw and allow him to watch. And it's just a good idea to have these like kids' ear defenders, as I think they do a good job. And I think it's also that thing of, dare I say it's a little bit like magicians in the way they set the scene. By sometimes wearing protective gear, it almost puts him in a different state of not being a total goofball and messing around. So I'd say there's almost a bit of theatre and a bit of suggestive manipulation, shall we say, in donning the health and safety stuff to imply this is serious and we don't just fool around. So I think it actually trains a really good behaviour. And I think that brings me on to these two, and I've mentioned these in other videos. I actually bought this first and foremost for myself, just because I've always been a fan of cordless glue guns that you have to basically rip out of power supply and then quickly apply, and then obviously lithium-ion batteries came along, and the rest is history. So these things, even though they're a little bit pricey, I don't know whether it's because I've been plugging them too well, but they've gone from being about £20 a go to now about £30 a go, but there you are. I still think they're an incredibly good investment, as when you press this little thing, it dispenses a very, very small amount of glue. And also, I don't know whether you can see from the nozzle just there, this truly is a much smaller nozzle, and you just can't put yourself in A&E by a burn with this. I mean, famous last words again. Supervise your kid. It's still hot glue, but it's just I feel much safer with him using this. He can do it in a much more controlled way. And again, the grip of this is just so much smaller than a big pistol grip in a gun style glue gun. So again, slightly, I mentioned this in a previous one, but this is, in case you don't recognize it, this is a Bosch screwdriver, and it basically has this little thing which is a torque limiter in it, which you can buy as an additional add-on. And what this does is it means, if you've seen the film Wallace and Gromit, where this basically gets stuck in the wall and he spins round on the back of the drill, this basically stops that from happening. So this will basically lock out and stop your child's wrist from getting a bit of a jolt, which is great. You know, it just gives them confidence. And then these drill bits, basically the whole pack, and there's at least the same amount of this again in smaller sizes, and this was like about £3 on Amazon. And so it just means that you can see it's a much slower speed. And of course, you know, for the professional tool people, there's a hell of a lot of play in this drill bit, but I'm not having him do any fine carpentry. He usually just wants to join in with whatever mummy and daddy are doing, and so him being able to drill a couple of holes is good. I'd say the only thing to maybe be a bit, you know, if I was going to redesign this, I would probably almost like, and I may even do it, is glue on like a little sort of chunk of plastic round here, like a little washer. Because what you don't want to do is have your child's fingers skip down here and then slice on the blade. So I've been telling him to always take the drill bit out by the silver bit and don't touch the gold bit. And so far, because the force of this is very, very small, we haven't had any problem. But if you wanted to be extra cautious, putting a stop out is the same. And in many ways, you see this on knives for whittlers. So, you know, if you go to Scandinavia, they have kids of 4 years old using whittling knives, a little bit like this, but they actually have it with essentially a block here, so that your fingers don't creep down onto the blade as you're using them. So again, I thought that was useful, and I'm just aware that obviously there's a lot of parents who are staring down the daunting prospect, including myself, of having, should we say, a little bit more quality time with their kids than maybe they signed up for. And so I think the inevitable thing is just sort of trying to include them, but in a safe way. So I should just touch on the last one, which is this thing which I've mentioned in a previous video, which is a Canary cardboard cutter made in Japan. And I think it's just one of those like really nifty little finds that you can use basically a moderately sharp bread knife to cut through cardboard, but this is basically just mildly serrated. You can maybe see if it focuses there on the edges. So all this does is it doesn't slice you deeply. It's not to say if you really went at yourself it would cut, but it's just infinitely safer than using a scalpel if your kid isn't quite ready for it. And I would say objectively, this just, even as someone who can use scalpels confidently with cardboard and has done for years, I still think this is just genuinely a really good tool. So again, I'll try and remember to throw a link in the bottom. So I hope that's useful, and good luck, and do share any tips in the link below. I'd really appreciate it. Always learning myself, so thanks again. Hope it's useful. Bye.